Berry Gordy built an empire. 2,000 songs, 60 number ones, 100 million records sold. But behind every hit was a contract, and inside every contract was a trap. Motown artists recorded the song of their lives and then watched Berry Gordy keep the money. Some fought back, some won, some won.
A young man, single and free.
10 one-hit wonders who dared to sue the most powerful man in Detroit. Number 10, Every Little Bit Hurts. Brenda Holloway, 1964. She was 17 years old when Berry Gordy signed her, and she was 17 years old when she became the first West Coast artist in Motown history.
Every night I cry, every night I sigh.
Brenda Holloway wasn't from Detroit. She was from Watts, Los Angeles, a church girl, a classically trained violinist, the kind of voice that makes a room go quiet without her even trying.
Yet you won't let me go.
Gordy signed her after watching her lip sync to Mary Wells at a DJ party in Los Angeles. He was so impressed by how she looked, he signed her before he properly heard her sing. Every Little Bit Hurts reached number 13 on the Hot 100 in 1964. But here's what most people don't know. Brenda hated that song. She had already recorded it 2 years earlier on a different label. She didn't want to do it again, Motown insisted. And then they shelved her second album entirely, a record called Hurtin' and Crying. Just buried it in a vault. Then Motown staff told her she dressed too much like Tina Turner. Then they gave her original compositions to other artists, including the Supremes. Then one day in 1968, she was in a Detroit recording studio in the middle of a session with Smokey Robinson, and she just walked out, left mid-take, married a minister, and disappeared from music for the next 20 years. But in 1969, Blood, Sweat, and Tears released You've Made Me So Very Happy, a song Brenda had co-written with her sister Patrice. It went to number 2 in America, and Gordy had listed himself as a co-writer on the copyright registration. Brenda sued, and in 1969, she won. She got her royalties for a song that became one of the biggest hits of the year that she wrote while Gordy got the credit.
The thing that you wanted before.
The Clash later covered Every Little Bit Hurts. Alicia Keys covered it at MTV Unplugged in 2005. Northern soul fans in Britain never stopped dancing to it. And for 20 years, nobody knew where Brenda Holloway was. She was in church singing for God, exactly like she always wanted. Number 9, Money, That's What I Want. Barrett Strong, 1960. He played the piano riff. He sang the lead vocal. He was in the room when it was written. And then Berry Gordy removed his name from the songwriting credits. Money, That's What I Want was the first major hit in Motown history. It sold over 1 million copies in 1960. The Beatles covered it. The Rolling Stones covered it. Led Zeppelin covered it. John Lennon kept it on his home jukebox.
Your love give me such a thrill.
Barrett Strong is the man who recorded it. He played the opening piano riff. He later said he invented while jamming on Ray Charles' What I Say in the studio that day. He was 19 years old. His name appeared on the original copyright registration with the United States Copyright Office. Then, at some point between that registration and the decades that followed, Gordy's team quietly removed his name. When Barrett Strong found out, he fought to have it reinstated. His legal argument was weakened because too many years had passed. Gordy's lawyers argued in court that Strong's name on the original copyright was, and I want you to hear how audacious this is, a clerical error. A clerical error. The man who played the piano, who sang the lead, who was in the room, a clerical error. Barrett Strong told the New York Times in 2013, and this is a direct quote, "Songs outlive people." The real reason Motown worked was the publishing. The records were just a vehicle to get the songs out there. The real money is in the publishing. And if you have publishing, hang on to it. He died on January 28, 2023, 81 years old. Never got full credit for the song that started everything. Listen, 90% of you watching these videos right now ain't subscribed yet. If these stories are blowing your mind, imagine what you're missing. Hit subscribe, turn on that bell, and join the R&B fans who never miss a Groove Lens upload. Number 8, My Guy, Mary Wells, 1964. Number 7, Buttered Popcorn, Florence Ballard, The Supremes, 1961. She named the group Supremes. Florence Ballard chose that name from a list of options handed to her by Motown staff. Diana Ross hated it, worried they'd be mistaken for a male vocal group. Gordy signed them anyway, and it was Florence who sang lead on the Supremes' very first single. Buttered Popcorn, a gritty, double-entendre-laced novelty song that Motown later described as, and this is in the Motown Encyclopedia, a gritty, double-entendre-laden novelty item. It didn't chart nationally, but it was Florence's voice, Florence's raw, southern-rooted, Billie Holiday-adjacent voice, that Motown later decided was too earthy for pop radio. They gave the lead to Diana Ross. For the next 6 years, Florence stood in the background of 10 #1 hits that her voice helped frame. In July 1967, at the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas, Berry Gordy fired her. Her settlement, $139,804 for 6 years for 10 #1 hits, for being the woman who named the group. Florence Ballard was given a non-disparagement clause. She couldn't even tell people she was a Supreme while trying to launch her solo career. In 1971, she sued Motown for additional royalties. She lost. By 1975, Florence Ballard was on welfare in Detroit. Her house had been foreclosed. She was 32 years old. She died of cardiac arrest on February 22, 1976. When Jennifer Hudson won the Oscar for Dreamgirls, the film inspired by Florence's story, she dedicated it to Florence Ballard, who never got a chance. Researchers estimate Florence should have earned between $900,000 and $1.3 million from the Supremes catalog alone. She received approximately $214,000 total for her entire life. Number 6, Want Ads, Honeycomb, 1971. Holland, Dozier, Holland. To tell this story, you have to understand what Holland, Dozier, Holland meant to Motown. Eddie Holland, Brian Holland, and Lamont Dozier. 25 number one hits. Between 1963 and 1967, they wrote almost everything that mattered. Heatwave, Baby, I Need Your Loving. You Can't Hurry, Love, Stop in the Name of Love, Reach Out, I'll Be There, Bernadette. The sound of America was the sound of Holland, Dozier, Holland, and they weren't being paid for it. In 1967, they staged a work slowdown. In 1968, they walked out of Motown entirely. Gordy sued them for breach of contract. They countersued. The litigation dragged on for nearly 10 years, one of the longest legal battles in music industry history. During those years, HDH launched their own labels, Hot Wax Records and Invictus Records, but there was a catch. The lawsuits prevented them from putting their own names on any music, so they wrote hits under the pseudonym Edith Wayne. Edith Wayne didn't exist. She was Holland Dozier, Holland in disguise. Under that name, Want Ads by the Honeycomb hit number one on both the Hot 100 and the R&B chart in 1971. Freda Payne's Band of Gold, also Edith Wayne, went number one in Britain, hit after hit after hit, all credited to a fictional woman because the real writers were in court fighting Barry Gordy. In early 1972, after a decade of litigation, Holland Dozier Holland reached an out-of-court settlement with Motown. The exact terms were never disclosed. But the three men who wrote 25 number ones, who built the sound of young America, had to hide behind a woman who didn't exist just to keep making music. Number 5, Keep On Truckin', Eddie Kendricks, 1973. Eddie Kendricks had one of the most distinctive voices in soul music. That pure, light falsetto, that effortless, almost weightless tenor. He was the lead voice on The Way You Do the Things You Do, the Temptations' very first charted hit. But by 1971, Eddie Kendricks was done with Barry Gordy, done with being one voice among many, done with the machine. He went solo on Tamla. And in 1973, Keep On Truckin' hit number one on the Hot 100. Boogie Down hit number 2, back-to-back smashes. His momentum was real, but the royalties weren't adding up. In 1978, Kendricks sued Motown for unpaid royalties related to his solo recordings. According to accounts in the book To Be Loved, the music, the magic, the memories of Motown. Motown's accounting practices with solo artists routinely charged excessive recoupment costs against artist royalty accounts, studio time, production fees, tour support, all charged against the artist, leaving many with little or nothing regardless of how well their records sold. Kendricks's case was settled out of court. The terms were sealed, but his relationship with Motown was permanently severed. He rejoined the Temptations in 1982 for a reunion album on Gordy Records. In 1989, Eddie Kendricks was diagnosed with lung cancer. He had one lung removed. He continued touring, performing with a microphone held close, one lung, that falsetto still holding. He died on October 5, 1992. He was 52 years old. Dennis Edwards, who had replaced David Ruffin in The Temptations, told reporters, "Eddie never stopped fighting for his music, for his money, for his breath." Number 4, Nowhere to Run. Martha Reeves and the Vandellas, 1965. Martha Reeves answered phones at Motown. Let me say that again. She answered phones. She was hired as a secretary for A&R chief Mickey Stevenson. One day in 1962, the scheduled backup singers didn't show up for a Marvin Gaye session. Martha stepped in, Barry Gordy heard her, and just like that, the secretary became a star. Dancing in the Street, Heat Wave, Nowhere to Run, Martha Reeves and the Vandellas were Motown's fire, the raw, sweaty, urgent counterweight to the polished elegance of the Supremes. But Gordy always favored the Supremes. He withheld Jimmy Mack for 2 years because he thought it sounded too much like a Supreme song. He sent the best material to Diana Ross and the accounting, Annette Beard and Betty Ashford. Two of the original Vandellas later claimed they had received no royalties from Motown dating back to the 1960s. Not a single payment for years of hits. In the 1980s, Martha Reeves and Beard and Ashford filed separate lawsuits against Motown for back royalties. Martha's suit resulted in a court award that specified royalties for current and future reissues of her past recordings. Beard and Ashford received at least one lump sum payment. But legal disputes continued through 2004, 40 years after Dancing in the Street. Martha Reeves was later elected to the Detroit City Council. She served 3 terms. The woman Barry Gordy, hired to answer his phones, spent decades fighting his company in court and then governed the city that made them both famous. Number 3, Leaving Here, Eddie Holland, 1964. Before Eddie Holland was the Eddie of Holland Dozier. Holland, he was a singer, a real one. He had a top 30 R&B hit in 1962 called Jamie. He was tracking a career. But then Brian Holland and Lamont Dozier showed him something. They were writing melodies faster than any lyricist could fill them. They needed Eddie, not as a singer, as a writer, he agreed.
I seen it all in a dream last night.
And Eddie Holland recorded one final significant single as a performer, Leaving Here, an urgent driving track about a man escaping a bad relationship. It barely registered in the United States, but The Who covered it in 1965. Motorhead covered it. Pearl Jam performed it. The song became a rock standard, while Eddie Holland was in the background writing Motown's entire catalog. And then in 1967, Eddie was the one who convinced his brother Brian and Lamont Dozier to stop working, to walk out to sue Barry Gordy for what they were owed. His legal argument was simple and devastating. Motown had been collecting mechanical royalties, performing rights royalties, and publishing royalties on songs that H.D.H. wrote, produced, and arranged, while paying the trio a flat rate that represented a fraction of what those songs were generating. The lawsuit that followed paralyzed Motown's creative engine. Holland Dozier. Holland won their settlement in 1972. Eddie Holland never recorded as a solo artist again. He gave up his singing career to write songs that made other people famous. And then he had to SUE to be paid for it. Number 2, I Heard It Through the Grapevine, Gladys Knight and the Pips, 1967. Gladys Knight and the Pips recorded I Heard It Through the Grapevine in 1966. Norman Whitfield and Barrett Strong wrote it. Whitfield produced the Gladys Knight version as a driving, urgent, call and response powerhouse. Berry Gordy shelved it. He sat on it for nearly a year, unsure whether to release it. When he finally did, it reached number 2 on the Hot 100 in November 1967 and number 1 on the R&B chart. But then Gordy turned around and gave Marvin Gaye a different, slower, darker version of the same song. Marvin's version went to number 1 in 1968. It spent 7 weeks at the top. It became one of the biggest singles in Motown history. Gladys Knight's version largely forgotten, overshadowed by Marvin, despite charting first. Despite being the reason Gordy greenlit the song at all, the Pips were not properly paid for their contribution to several Motown recordings. And in the years that followed their departure from Motown in 1973, legal disputes over unpaid royalties from the Motown era were documented in multiple published accounts of the label's history. Gladys Knight confirmed in interviews that accounting under their Motown contracts had been consistently unfavorable to the artists. She and the Pips went to Butter Records in 1973 and recorded Midnight Train to Georgia, which Berry Gordy had turned down. It went to number 1. It won them the Grammy for Best R&B Song. The song Berry Gordy said no to gave Gladys Knight her legacy. Number 1, It Takes Two, Kim Weston and Marvin Gaye, 1966. Kim Weston was supposed to be the next Mary Wells. When Wells left Motown in 1964, Berry Gordy pointed at Kim Weston. She had a voice like gospel thunder wrapped in silk. She had the look, she had the range, she had everything. He paired her with Marvin Gaye, and in 1966, It Takes Two became one of the most joyful, most immediate, most perfectly constructed duets in the history of American music. Two voices bouncing off each other like they'd been singing together since before they were born. It Takes Two reached number 14 on the Hot 100, number 4 on the R&B chart. It's been sampled by Rod Stewart, used in advertising campaigns worldwide, and played at weddings for 50 years. But Kim Weston never got what the song was worth. She was married to Motown executive Mickey Stevenson, the same A&R chief who had hired Martha Reeves to answer phones. When Stevenson left Motown in 1967, Kim left with him, and Motown wasn't happy about it. What followed was a years-long battle over royalties owed from her recordings. including It Takes Two, which continued generating income for Motown long after Kim Weston was no longer on the label.
It takes two, baby.
The accounting was, by her account, a wall of numbers that added up to nothing. Expenses, recoupment, charges, the machine doing what the machine does.
To make a dream come true.
Kim Weston eventually received a settlement for royalties owed. She later became a community arts advocate in Detroit, performing at civic events, teaching young singers, fighting for arts funding in the public schools.
Just take two.
The woman Barry Gordy, positioned as the next Mary Wells, spent the rest of her career pouring music back into the city that took it from her.
Just take two. Just take two.
It Takes Two, she once said in an interview, was the title of a love song, but it was also the truth about how Motown worked. It takes two to make a hit, but only one of them kept the money. 10 songs, 10 battles, 10 artists who stood in front of Barry Gordy's machine and said, "What you owe me is mine." Some won more than others, some won and still lost everything. But every one of them fought, because that's what the music deserved. If this hit different, drop the artist in the comments who shook you the most and subscribe, because the next chapter is coming.